Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
I have a confession to make.
And what's that, John?
Does the month of November 2019 have any particular significance to you?
Oh, absolutely. Especially if you're in LA.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's when and where Blade Runner happens.
Yeah.
At least the first one.
And we had an episode back in November of 2019.
Uh-huh.
And we talked a bit about Blade Runner.
Uh-huh.
And it is now, well, we're well into the throes of October 2020.
Yeah.
And I just fixed a typo. So, in our show notes, I had misspelled Blade Runner. I apologize.
That's embarrassing, because that's something you can easily look up, John.
And you know what the sad thing is? I had looked it up because one of those typos was linking to the film itself, like actually linking out to a page that I had visited and copied the link from and put into our show notes, and I still got the name wrong. So I am sorry. It is now corrected.
That is good. That is good. Nearly a year later.
And it's not like it was just one spot. Every single spot in the show notes where I had written Blade Runner, I had written it as one word.
Well, at least you were consistent in your error.
Yeah, I'm consistent in my error. Indeed, I was. So I am sorry about that. I know you are a big fan of Blade Runner, and clearly I have some learning to do.
Perhaps as penance, I should make you sit down and watch it with me again, since you clearly don't appreciate the genius of Blade Runner.
Well, I do now own a physical copy. So,
do you really?
I'll
okay.
grow on me.
I think you're only like 4 or 5 copies behind me now. I've owned that on pretty much every medium I think it's been released on, including multiple copies, because of course there have been 30 different, director's cuts and super director's cuts, and no, really, this is actually the final cut, and oh no, that wasn't actually really the final cut, but this one really is. And yeah, so there's been a couple of edits of that film.
So do you have a favorite cut?
This is going to piss a lot of people off, but I actually do like the theatrical cut with the voiceover that Harrison Ford did, which you've probably never seen or heard.
I have not.
I know a lot of people dislike it. I dislike some of the scenes that they cut out of it, and I like some of the scenes that have been added in later cuts. But I'm actually a fan of the voiceover for a number of reasons. It helps with the film noir aspect of the film. And I know that some people are, a little annoyed because it's like, well, I don't need this explained to me. I know exactly what this is. But it helps. It helps with that sort of genre, fitting it in there. And so I don't actually mind the voiceover like many, many fans do. But at the same time, I also do like the, the final cut that was released recently. Recently. It's been a while. Been 5 years, I think, since the final cut was released. So, yeah, I don't actually mind the final cut. I don't mind the theatrical cut, at least from the point of view of the things that annoy people about it.
I know there's a whole new take, too, with 2049.
Well, 2049, I like what Denis Villeneuve did with 2049, and I know that they had planned a third one, and in fact, Villeneuve was supposed to direct a third one. I just hope that the 2049 one made enough money that they were able to justify doing a third one. I don't know, with the way that movies have not been making a lot of money this year, maybe that will still be appealing, even though it wasn't, sort of not guaranteed to make $1 billion or whatever. Hopefully some studio picks it up and does the third one, because I'm a big fan of what Denis Villeneuve did.
Do you think Harrison Ford will be back for the third installment?
I don't know. I'm amazed that he's still getting up and acting at all, considering some of his accidents in the last couple of years, because he's been involved in small plane accidents and things like that. So I'm a little shocked that the man is, and he's in his 80s. At some point or another, the body is just not happy with crashing in a plane. So I don't even know if I can handle that at half his age. So I don't know if we'll see him in a third one or not.
Yeah, if I were Harrison Ford, I think I'd just grow tired of continually having to relive my youth. Just getting pulled back for so many films, like Indiana Jones, Star Wars. Yeah,
exactly.
Blade Runner.
At least he was smart with Star Wars and told them that he wanted to be killed off quickly.
Kill me off, yeah.
Yeah, that was the smartest thing he did about Star Wars. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. And he had a pretty significant role in 2049. It's not like he was just a little bit character that was showing up in there. So we'll see. And I mean, Ryan Gosling's obviously available, so he did a good job in 2049. I was happy with what he did.
Yeah. I apologize if we just spoiled the Star Wars sequels. Not even sequels, like the prequels.
I don't know, postquels.
All right.
We'll go with that. At this point, you know what? There's sort of a statute of limitations on spoilers, and at this point, if you haven't seen it by now, well, that's your own damn fault because it's been years since those were released.
Fair enough. Mind you, my son has yet to see a single Star Wars.
Well, that is true. I mean, what's the quote that every day someone's born who hasn't seen the Flintstones, and so yeah, you're right. Not everybody has seen them, but I don't think your son is listening to Off Hours just yet. We'll give him a couple of years before we start forcing him to go back and listen to the back catalog.
I will never force him to do that.
Oh, well, that's okay. That's why I'm here. Right?
Another neat bit of sci-fi that crossed my radar recently was a little video going inside Industrial Light and Magic and shedding a little light on them doing a bit of a throwback to going back to using old school miniatures to film the Razor Crest.
Yeah, this was something that had come across my radar, and I've just been so busy with other things the last week or so that I completely forgot to watch it. But you forwarded it on to me, and we sat down and watched it. And yeah, this is impressive, some of the work that they were doing on The Mandalorian. And I know that they've done some really progressive work on The Mandalorian with some of the soundstage work they've been doing and things like that, where they're, instead of doing a full green screen, they're actually projecting the environment onto a massive screen in the background. So it gives you a better sense of actually being there rather than just completely green screening it. This was all about how they decided to build a physical model of the Razor Crest, the ship that the Mandalorian flies. And it's interesting looking at how they've gone off and done it. I mean, first off, they're using a Form 3 printer, like the one that I've got sitting about 15 feet to my left, and using that to actually build the model. And then they were using motion control. In fact, in some cases, the same motion control equipment that was being used 20 years ago, 30 years ago for some of this work. And they did it so that they could get the look and feel that the original trilogy had in terms of how the ship was flying. And of course, a lot of that came from the limitations of the motion control equipment. With CG, you can shoot it from any angle. You can have the camera pan or, tilt or twist or whatever, any angle you want. But obviously with motion control, you have physical limitations. And so they wanted to capture that look and feel. And that's why they decided to make a physical model of it.
And they still got some impressive amount of control out of the motion control units they ended up building. It was disarmingly satisfying for me. So one of the gentlemen in this little movie is John Knoll. And he has been at ILM for a long time, but he's actually the co-creator of Photoshop. And it was just really neat for me to see him as having created this tool that has just unleashed an incredible amount of creative potential and has really just paved the way for digital visual effects to even occur. And to see him in his own shop turning and throwing chips on a lathe to build out this motion control unit in this like assuredly calm frenzy to meet a deadline was just fantastic. Well,
and he admits in there that he actually wrote motion control software years ago for doing video work, and so this was sort of a throwback to stuff that he did early in his career, which is kind of impressive. So. Yeah, it was interesting to see that team, and obviously a lot of guys in there have been doing this for a very, very long time. I kind of get the impression that ILM is one of those places where once you start working there, you kind of never stop working there, and you don't go. Even if they fire you, you just sort of don't leave because it's, or you come back on projects years later or whatever because it's sort of tough to get out of the gravity of the projects that ILM gets to work on.
Yeah. It kind of sounds like it's exactly what happened with John Goodson, who's the fellow actually putting the pieces of the model all together for them to shoot. And the first time I had watched it through, I thought they had been actually using the 3D prints all assembled for doing the captures with their motion control system. But then, the second time watching it through there, you caught him talking about the fact that they actually cast the finished product, and you were saying this probably so that they could have different mount points without having to rebuild and reprint everything from scratch, which would have been very time consuming.
Yeah, I think one of the guys was saying that they had a couple of 3D printers running 24/7 for several weeks in order to produce all of the parts that they needed to be able to actually assemble this thing. It's a reasonably large scale model that they were producing. It was like 20-1 or something like that. Like, it was a pretty sizable thing. It was probably 2 feet long or something like that. So yeah, it was. It would obviously take some effort to get that thing printed and get it out there.
Yeah, it was just really neat to see that handcraft at work in a very digital age.
Yeah, exactly. And then later on, when they were showing off the lighting that they were doing when the ship is flying through atmosphere through a desert, and they actually ended up creating this what do they call it, a gazebo for a light gazebo for the model, where they were then projecting the sky and the scenery onto these whiteboards around it, so that they could get the correct reflections and tones and sort of ambient visuals on the ship, so that it wasn't, because that stuff's really tough to model properly if you're using lights or going in afterwards and trying to model it. So this was a way for them to sort of, again, model it in real life. And it's so much easier to capture in camera than trying to do it afterwards in post. I will say one of the surprising things was the fact that they were using a relatively inexpensive Canon DSLR for capturing the footage. There are so many better cameras out there, that are sort of small cameras that, they could have used. Now, I guess really all you need to be able to do is capture sort of 4K footage and you'll be happy with it. But I was a little surprised that they were using a relatively inexpensive consumer. Yeah, and when I say consumer, I don't just mean, the fact that Canon is producing consumer cameras. They produce really high-end cinema cameras as well. And but just that they were, it was like an EOS R or something like that. Like, it was a really, it was like a $2,500 DSLR that they were shooting with. It wasn't a particularly impressive camera, even as DSLRs go for shooting film.
Well, but they were still able to make magic happen.
Yeah, that's true. It's they made it look good, and it matched up really well with the CGI models that they were using for it as well.
Yeah, so you hold the same guitar as Jimi Hendrix, but you won't be able to play like Jimi Hendrix. But you give Jimi Hendrix a guitar from a thrift shop, and he'll still be able to play like Jimi Hendrix.
That is true.
So it seemed like it was a bit of a skunkworks project, and it was neat to see everybody rally around it and watch, I guess, in retrospect for us, but to see the scope of the project expand just because the results were so promising. Yeah,
I got the impression that somebody, maybe Jon Favreau, said, it would be really cool if we could do this. What was his comment? He's like, one of the things I learned from Guillermo del Toro was if you make a model of something, you get to keep it in your house afterwards. And so, he's like, hey, can we make a model of the Razor Crest? And from there, it snowballed into, instead of them doing it all in 3D, they decided to do it all in real life. So that was kind of funny. And obviously the project creep that happened, and it was massive. I'm not sure that I would have wanted to be on that team. I would have gotten pretty frustrated with that.
Sounds like it's somewhat of an opportunity of a second lifetime.
Yeah,
for some of these guys coming back and getting to do this again.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's been a little while since we chatted last.
Yeah, it's thanks to the episode we recorded with Christian and broke up into a couple of episodes. It's been nearly a month since we recorded last.
Mm-hmm. And when we left off there, our last episode, or we got off on a couple of tangents, you had dropped something into the show notes that you'd wanted to talk about.
Yeah, there's this watch from Ferdinand Berthoud, this chronometer FB2RE that came out a little while ago. And I don't even know, is there a date on this? Oh yeah, August 18th is the date from the Watches by SJX article. So yeah, it's been a little while since this dropped. Yeah, this watch is hilarious because it sort of hits all of the buttons of everything that we've been talking about over the last sort of year or two about precision timekeeping and trying to improve isochronism and everything like that. And it's sort of in some of the other things that we've talked about, like, rouleau triangles and things like that. So it's sort of, it's a bit like off hours bingo. It's almost as if somebody there has been listening to our show and said, yeah, let's put a constant force mechanism on this, and let's do put a rouleau triangle in here, and let's throw a fusee in there as well, just for fun. Like it seems to be hitting all of those notes when it comes to the different technologies that they've decided to put into this. Oh, and of course, Rich's favorite. It's got a free sprung balance in here.
We just got off on a little tangent talking about that.
Yeah. Sorry, Rich. We're not going to go on too much of a tangent on this one.
Yeah, they've really pulled out all the stops with this particular watch, and I appreciate that they sort of changed course a bit from where they were going with their FB1 in terms of the case shape. That it's had an octagonal case, and with the FB2RE, they've gone to a more classically styled case, although it is not classically styled, and just more so. It is a round.
It's a round case, yes, as opposed to classically styled, because it's certainly the exterior of it is rather unique, and I think they were talking about how they're trying to reference portholes and things like that, and elements of sort of naval design, because this was inspired by a marine chronometer that had been designed by Ferdinand Berthoud. So that they were trying to take that as inspiration, and there's even a nice little viewport on the side, so you can see some of the mechanism as it's going. Mm-hmm.
Which, curiously enough, the part that is showing off is like the one of the few parts I actually could have done without on the watch. I'm not a huge fan of the fusee and chain, but I understand why people do it, and I would say it's anachronistic, but then you'll turn around and tell me that mechanical watches themselves are... I
was going to say everything about a mechanical watch is anachronistic, so, if you're going to do something, you may as well go all out, right?
I'd push back a little bit in that I think it's actually kind of from cutting edge and futuristic that you've got something that runs without a battery.
Futuristic in, the sense of 350 years old, but sure, yeah.
Retro-futuristic.
Yeah, exactly.
But another aspect of the case that I do really admire is the interior polish on the movement side, on the inside of the case. That's not something that I can recall ever having seen before on any watch. And that to me just speaks to the quality of finish that went into this entire timepiece.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? You look at the technology and you say, okay, this is impressive. They have really thrown everything in the kitchen sink in this, and then on top of that, it is finished to a ridiculous level. Like some of these macro shots that SJX has posted, and you look at the level of finish that's on these things, and it is shocking how good it is. Yeah, so as SJX says in his article, the only weakness of the watch is the price at around 210,000 Swiss francs, which is about $230,000 US. It is not exorbitantly priced, but it is expensive.
Yeah, it certainly is expensive.
I would have to argue. I think it is rather exorbitantly priced. It may be justifiable in its price, but it isn't. Certainly isn't the sort of thing that you're going to go out and buy a handful of for your groomsmen at a wedding, right? Like or at least I'm not. Right? I'm not going to spend houses worth of money on a watch, unfortunately. But it is shocking just how good everything in this is. And again, we see these technological marvels, and sometimes you look at the finish that's on them, and it's like, wow, okay, you guys kind of cheaped out on the finish on that watch. But this case, they went all out on everything, and it's rather impressive.
Another aspect of the case that I quite admired was the inlay in the crown there. So a laser-etched piece of ceramic. Mm-hmm. So that was a nice touch.
Yeah, that was an interesting touch. I've as we've talked about, I've been starting to play around with laser engraving and playing with both a fiber laser and a CO2 laser, and I've never played around with ceramics. I think I've got a little bit of it around some machinable ceramics. It'd be interesting to try laser engraving it, and see how it works, see what's involved with it. But yeah, this looks great. It's a wonderful look. Great contrast as well with the black ceramic.
Mm-hmm. Have you taken a piece of sapphire to your laser yet?
I have not. It's tempting though. I just bought a couple of sample crystals for some watches that I'm working on. So I suspect one or two of them will probably not be the correct size. So maybe I'll give it a try and see if I can do some laser engraving on it.
I could laser engrave your Silverhand logo, just like the Omega logo or the Rolex logo on some of their crystals.
Yeah, exactly. Right in the center of it.
Very subtly.
Yeah. See if I can get that working. As I said, I'm not sure what would be involved in laser engraving a non-metal like that. Like I don't even know where I would start on the parameters. So that would take some fiddling around with it, because certainly there's no guides out there for here's how to take your synthetic sapphire and laser engrave it with your fiber laser.
I'm certain it would have made Vianney Halter's life much easier back when he was making his sapphire automatic winding rotors and trying to drill through a piece of sapphire.
Yeah, that would have, what a nightmare that would have been.
Yeah, I'm sure a laser will go through it like butter. Maybe not quite as fast.
The other problem there with the sapphire, of course, is that you're also dealing with something that's translucent. So oftentimes your laser needs to sort of quote unquote hit something in order to actually start affecting it. And so that's one of the reasons why high polished silver is a problem, because it just reflects straight off the surface. And so in this case, it's not reflecting off the surface, it's just going straight through the surface. So I'd be kind of curious. You'd have to get your focus point exactly right and hope that it's actually doing what you want it to do.
Well, underneath the sapphire crystal on the Ferdinand Berthoud is a lovely enamel dial. You get it in either white or black, and it's a two-part dial, and it has all the numerals applied in enamel as well. And one of the neat aspects of this that I found interesting, which is, again, is not something I'd heard of being done before in a watch, or outside of a watch for that matter, and that is that they set the enamel on a piece of steel rather than gold or copper or a more common substrate like that. Mm-hmm. And the reasoning was so that they wouldn't have to counter enamel the back of it, and they could have a thinner dial that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the challenges with enamel come from, and the reason why we counter enamel stuff is because as the enamel cools, it contracts. There's a coefficient of expansion in the enamel. So depending on whether you're talking about it at room temperature versus at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, where it's a liquid, there is a change in its thermal expansion. And the same thing happens with the metal. And so typically what you do is you buy an enamel that's actually engineered for the metal that you are enameling on. So usually the enamels that you would use for something like steel are actually different than the enamels that you would use for precious metal, because the coefficient of expansion is actually different. And with metals, you can run into problems where even though the enamel will actually fuse to the metal, the coefficient of expansion is different enough that as it cools, all of a sudden it shatters because it's fused to the metal, and now the metal is contracted at a different rate than the enamel has. I'm wondering if also the enamel that they're using happens to be sort of more dialed into the exact coefficient of expansion of the metal of the steel that they're using. It may be that that it's a closer match, because of course the enamels that I'm using for my work, they're designed to work on copper, gold, silver, and even though all of those metals have a similar coefficient of expansion, it's not identical. And so some metals will work better than others, and I'm sure that some of those enamels are also going to work better than others on the metals. So I wonder if also that it just happens to be that their metal and their enamel are better matched from that point of view.
I'd almost wonder what would be easier to do, to tune your alloy of steel to match the enamel, or to tune the enamel to match the steel. Because I know you can subject the enamels to various sorts of acid to change the point at which they fuse, but I don't know how to sort of impact their rate of expansion or contraction for that matter. Yeah,
that's something that gets into a whole level of chemistry that I don't know anything about in terms of enamels. I know that it's a lot of that stuff is sort of closely guarded secrets and is sort of a lot of black magic. It's sort of a non-trivial thing to design an enamel properly. And so, again, I don't know what's involved. I just know from my own experiments some of the problems that I've run into where just because you can get it diffused doesn't mean that it's actually going to play nicely afterwards.
And in the case of one of your pens, you wouldn't really have a need to counter enamel the inside of the shaft, because it's not going to bow or go concave on you the way a watch dial would.
Yeah, one of the advantages of enameling on a cylinder is that you ideally have equal forces on the entire surface of the pen. You do have some other issues that you have to deal with, but you're not getting the enamel pulling and twisting the part out of flat, essentially. So that is problematic. And I know that you can have some serious problems as you start getting into larger and larger pieces. I know a few people who've enameled large pieces, like, think about something like the size of a small desk, like a small table. And dealing with those forces are challenging because the enamel is incredibly strong. That ability to shift its shape and contract as it's cooling is very impressive. And even on something like a disc that's, let's say, 2 or 3 inches in diameter, you can take a disc which has a very slight dome to it, and all of a sudden it'll have a cup in it at the end if you don't counter enamel it. So it's managed to not only, it's not taking a flat piece, it's actually taking a dome piece, which should have some strength, and it'll actually pop it the other direction just through the strength of the enamel cooling. So it is remarkable, the strength that it has. And again, that depends on how well fused it is to the metal, because in other cases I've had it just pop right off. Like I've had the enamel pop right off of the metal because it hasn't fused properly, and as it's cooling, it just says, all right, I've given up, and popped off. So it's enameling is frustrating.
I cannot imagine putting something the size of a desk into a kiln. I would not want to be responsible or liable for how the enamel turned out on a piece like that, or even just trying to rotate something like that in the furnace. Yeah,
it is remarkable, some of the extreme work that people do with enamels. And in some cases, it's not so difficult because they've got a lot of leeway. They're using, like in this case, one of the advantages they have is that they're using an opaque enamel as the base, right? That opaque white hides a lot of sins, right? You don't care about the consistency of the enamel. You don't care about the exact thickness of the enamel over the metal. You don't care if there's air pockets in it. All those things can have an effect on the final piece, and might have problems if you're polishing it or whatever. But at the end of the day, you don't see those microscopic air bubbles like you do with a translucent enamel. That's one of the challenges when you're going over guilloche, is that you have all these little air pockets that sort of form inside of the cuts of your engine turning. So it is challenging when you're dealing with that. And your flux, for instance, as it's coming out of the of the enamel, that can be problematic as well because it can form little air pockets and stuff. So the fact that they've used a solid white enamel, that hides a lot of sins. Right? They've solved a lot of problems just by doing that alone. Minor variances in the thickness of the enamel are not really an issue. And actually, speaking of that, one of the interesting trends that I've seen a lot of lately are these fume dials that people are doing. And it's funny because, people are talking about, oh, these are great. These are, they're innovative and things like that. And I look at it as an enamelist, and I'm less like, oh, that's actually a really good way of hiding a problem. Because one of the issues that you run into with enamel is that if it's not all exactly the same thickness, then you get dark spots and light spots, and it looks sort of splotchy. But what's happening with these fume dials is that they're intentionally making parts of the dial thicker than others in the enamel. And that's what gets you that transition from a pale color to a darker color, let's say from the center to the outside. They've just put a little dome into the part, and then they've enameled it, and then they've ground the top of the enamel flat so that it's thicker around the edges than it is in the center. And it's a great way of not having to deal with getting really consistent color across the entire face of your dial. And it also happens to look good. So there are sort of advantages from both senses.
And you don't have to worry about a consistent finish across the top either, or little air bubbles that might rupture pieces of dust. You're going to grind that all up.
Exactly. There's so many advantages to doing it, and again, it looks good, and it's popular right now. And I'm kind of curious to play around with it a little bit. I haven't seen anybody do any over engine turning. I've seen some textured work with both the enamel textured as well as the silver textured underneath. So it'd be kind of fun to play with some enamel or some engine turning and see how it looks. And see if it's worthwhile pursuing.
Mm-hmm. And on a flux note, I'd actually be curious to know what sort of flux they're using to get the enamel to adhere to the steel. And I'm not clear on whether they're using a stainless steel or a high carbon steel or what it is they're using.
It's probably going to be a high carbon steel. From my little bit of reading, as I said, I don't know a lot about enameling on steel. I've done a little bit of reading on it. Thompson Enamels out of the U.S., they've actually published some good articles about the science of enamels and some of the differences between the different types of enamels that are out there. I think it's going to be a carbon steel. I don't think it's going to be stainless. And the flux isn't actually going to help with it fusing so much. The flux is really about sort of keeping the metal clean as you're applying heat to it. Right? That's what you're trying to prevent oxides forming on the surface of the metal so that there's no barrier between the metal and the enamel as you're actually, you're fusing it. So that's really the trick with a lot of the fluxes. It's more about protecting that metal underneath it. And that's why you really want to try and get a complete layer of enamel on the part in that first firing, because that way you can then, you don't have to worry about the metal underneath. It's no longer going to oxidize as quickly. You're still going to get a reaction between the oxides in the enamel and the metal, and that's what you want because that's what gets you the color that you're looking for. But you don't have to worry about the metal itself oxidizing and causing problems with fusing to the glass afterwards.
Something else that you blew my mind with recently with respect to stainless steel is the casting of stainless steel. This I had not heard of.
Yeah, it's a common thing in the jewelry industry when you're making inexpensive stainless steel jewelry is actually casting 316L stainless steel jewelry. Yeah.
It sounds like quite the process that goes into it to make sure that you don't end up with any porosity and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's funny once you start getting into with all casting, there's always porosity problems, but they're a little bit easier to deal with in some of the lower temperature metals like silver and gold. And I can't believe that I say that those are lower temperature metals because you're still casting them at close to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're not exactly low temperature. It's not like lead or gallium or something like that. But in terms of useful metals that we're using in jewelry and stuff like that, they're still relatively low temperature because when you get into things like platinums, you're talking, 3,500. When you're talking about tantalum, what was it I saw the other day? Tantalum's like 4,800 degrees Fahrenheit or something like that. Like it's obscene the temperatures you need to get to melt tantalum properly. Stainless steel is not too bad. It's sort of in the middle at about 2,800. So it's probably close to a lot of bronzes in terms of its casting temperature. And as you get into those temperature ranges, you start having bigger and bigger problems with porosity, with oxygen in the metal. And so a lot of them are being cast. Typically you pull a vacuum on your casting chamber and then you backfill it with argon, pure argon. And that argon tends to cause fewer problems with the metal. The same thing we do this with when we're casting the platinum metals. We typically want to use a vacuum and then backfill with argon to do that. And so the same thing's being done with the stainless steel. So it's not a trivial setup to be able to do this kind of casting. It's certainly not something that I'm able to do here in the shop.
I'm impressed by the science and technique behind it, and that it's doable at a mass scale at all. This is quite neat.
Yeah, it's an impressive setup, and some of the other things that we were talking about. Teresa Frey at Techform Casting, she's somebody that's spoken at the Santa Fe Symposium a number of times. I've met her and chatted with her about a bunch of the technology that she's using. She's presented a number of papers on a process that she's been helping develop a lot, which is hot isostatic pressing, or HIP. And in that case, they're using this high temperature chamber under pressure with inert gases to actually compress the metal afterwards and force the porosity out of the casting. So even no matter how good you are and no matter how controlled your environment is, you're always going to end up with some level of porosity. And the impressive thing about this is that they're basically eliminating it by sitting there and squishing it out under high pressure. And the results that they're getting is really impressive. And certainly if you look at some of Teresa's papers, she talks about the techniques and exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And yeah, it's remarkable what they're doing. So I'm curious to get some parts cast in stainless steel and see, how good it actually is, particularly when it comes to my lugs. Like the lugs are one of the challenging bits of a case, and especially if you're using a profile that can't be turned easily. And, the top profile of the lugs, if they can be turned, then that's pretty simple. But in my case, that top profile can't be turned properly. And so it's a little bit more challenging to machine and get a good surface and get a nice sort of consistent edge out of that or curve out of it. And it would certainly be advantageous if I can, get some of those parts cast, and especially considering the reduction in porosity that she's getting out of those castings.
Mm-hmm. Looking forward to seeing how those turn out for you.
Yeah.
And for anyone else who's curious to learn more about hot isostatic pressing, we'll be sure to link to some of her papers in the show notes for you to read up on as well. And just looping back to the Ferdinand Berthoud, one last bit of metallurgy talk on the dial there is the second hand. It's made of titanium, and it's blued. And unlike the hour or the minute hand, unfortunately, for some of those reasons, it is not highly polished. It does not have that mirror finish on it. And instead, they've sort of sandblasted it. And part of the reasoning there, they say, is that they were aiming for thinness and making that particular part as light as possible. So to try and achieve a black polish on something that thin, it's just much easier to do more of a frosted finish on that hand. But that is really the only area where it seems like they cut any corners on their level of finish.
And I'm not sure how easy it is to black polish titanium anyways. I don't think titanium is a relatively soft metal, and it tends to roll a lot. And so the harder the metal is, the easier it is to get a black polish on it. So I don't even know if it's possible, regardless of the thickness of the material. I don't know if it's even possible to get a good black polish on titanium.
De Bethune has blown my mind on a number of occasions, having achieved an incredibly high level of polish on titanium, and often on shapes where it must have taken an obscene amount of time and effort to pull it off. So it is achievable, but I myself am not a fan of polishing titanium.
No, I can't imagine that it would be fun. Sort of like, it's even worse than trying to polish something like aluminum or something like that. It's kind of miserable to polish.
So moving on to the movement side of the watch, this is where the real magic is in terms of the level of fit and finish of this timepiece. To my eye, just a absolutely superb level of finish up there with the best of them. And certainly no shortage of decisions on ways to show off that level of finish, either from the interior angles to the incredibly fine spokes on the 3-arm stop wheel for the remontoir. Just I've said mind-boggling too much this episode, haven't I? Yeah. A very impressive level of finish.
It's giving me some ideas on where I should go and what I should try and do with some of the finishing eventually that I want to do on movements. I don't want to do any movement finishing on these like ETA 7001s that I'm working with right now, but for some of my own custom movement stuff in the future, it's nice to get sort of great examples of this so that I can decide, okay, if I'm going to do something, if I'm going to go out of my way to make a custom watch movement, I might as well put the time and effort into finishing it properly. Well, what does great finishing look like? And this is one of those examples that you can sit down and say, here's an example of great finishing. And not only is it great finishing, but there is every possible combination of finishing surfaces that are in here that you can, take a look at. Like I'm impressed with the, sort of the dial plates. They've done a rough textured dial on, for the plates. But then they've also gone off and done, really high polished surfaces in other areas. And so you can get great examples of a bunch of different finishing techniques in here and sort of pick and choose what you want to try and accomplish. And this gives you sort of a bar to try and reach, which is nice. It's good to see something like that.
And beyond just the finish too, there are the design choices made in laying out the movement. And much like Regepi's Chronomètre Contemporain, this is a very symmetrical movement, and it's laid out in that way. And we as humans tend to like
that symmetry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We could probably go on for hours talking about this watch. And in fact, you and I have talked for probably an hour or more at this point, or, off air about this watch. So we won't continue going on for too much longer, I don't think, because we could just keep going and going. Everything about this is great.
Yeah, one other aspect, just I think worth touching on in terms of the finish that I think lends it a different sort of air and depth than you'd get in a lot of other movements, is the fact that they've gone for more of a pillar plate layout in the old school sense. So a lot of bridges in modern calibers, or pretty much any bridge in a modern caliber, is going to lay flush against the main plate, whereas they've made the decision to raise everything up on pillars so that the bridges are floating over the main plate, which just lends even more contrast to those high polished chamfers and the frosting on the main plate beneath.
This actually reminds me a lot of the dial side of the movements from, Breguet or Daniels or, Roger Smith, somebody like that. This sort of has that feel in terms of those raised elements, the pillar, up on pillars like that. A lot of the dial side of movements from those makers looked very much like that, and it's nice to see this on the movement side of the movement and under a crystal, so we can actually see what the heck it looks like.
Mm-hmm. And you did touch on the rouleau triangle there very briefly. And we've gone off on tangents about rouleau triangles before, so we will not go off on a tangent here. But one notable improvement to this particular mechanism, which is based on a Gaffner system for the remontoir, is that they have actually machined the rouleau triangle that operates the remontoir out of ruby. So that will give a really nice coefficient of friction there as that's moving about and causing the remontoir to deliver a constant amount of energy to the balance wheel.
Well, and also something they said about that is that that's at a point in the mechanism that has very, very low torque. There's, you have to be careful about how much energy you're using as part of that mechanism, just because it is so far away from the power, the mainspring itself. So, doing everything you can in this case by machining that cam out of ruby certainly helps with all of that. And I imagine that it must have taken them some time to tweak that and get that right balance of how do you affect that, or how do you make that mechanism, how do you make that constant force mechanism without adversely affecting the timing of it, just because you're sucking up so much power from the mechanism from that far down from the powertrain. So they've done an impressive job with that, and I really like some of the design choices they've made with it. Derek Pratt's watch that he isn't really working on anymore because he's no longer with us, unfortunately, has a similar mechanism in it as well. They made a couple of different design choices in theirs, but I really like that Gaffner mechanism, that remontoir that they've got in there. And I think I've also seen it used, not just, this is on the escape wheel. I've also seen it used on the second wheel as well. And in fact, I think that's originally how Gaffner used it, if I remember correctly. It was on the second wheel. So there's a couple of different places that you can use it, but using it on the escape wheel like this, you do have to be really careful about how much energy you're losing in there, just because you don't have a lot of energy at that point to lose.
Mm-hmm. And another watch that dropped recently that also has a novel constant force mechanism in it is the T0 Tourbillon from Seiko. And this is another piece from their brand new studio in Japan. And unlike the Ferdinand Berthoud piece, it is not astronomically expensive. It is not exorbitantly expensive. It's you can't buy it.
Yeah, one would say that it's impossibly expensive.
Fair enough.
and honestly, looking at this movement, it is the least Seiko looking watch movement I think I have ever seen. It does not. It looks like something that Max would make at MB&F more than as something that Seiko would make.
No, it is it definitely has a very different aesthetic than just about any other Seiko caliber that has ever been made.
Mm-hmm.
This is very much a concept piece, but they are certainly flexing their chops here in producing this. I mean, it looks absolutely nothing like the NSA5 that we had talked about a few episodes back, which also comes from the same studio, and it sounds like these two watches, or watch movements rather, sort of influenced one another during the process of developing them there at Grand Seiko. Now, I'm not positive exactly how the constant force mechanism is operating in this particular watch, but I did catch that they're using a 5-armed stop wheel rather than the 3-armed variant that they've got there in the Ferdinand Berthoud.
Yeah, I haven't seen any good explanations about what they're doing from a technical point of view. Looking at it visually, as I mentioned, it doesn't look like something that Seiko would make. But there's certainly some interesting, from an aesthetic point of view, there's some interesting aesthetics in here. Some of the shapes they've chosen to use, some of their choice of, I don't know what they're using as a base material for it. Probably a nickel silver, but the finish that they've put on it is a very dark finish. It's almost like a gunmetal finish. That has then allowed them to create a lot of interesting contrast with gold metals and with looks like blued steel or blued titanium in there. So they've some of their design choices in here, the shapes of some of the hands that they've put on it, very, very interesting, and certainly gives me ideas for ways that I could shape parts in the future, whether they be hands or whether they be cocks or whatever they are. This gives you the option. This sort of gives you some ideas for, oh yeah, that's a great look for for a mechanism inside or a part inside of a watch. And creating the contrast that they have is quite remarkable.
Yeah, for that blued metal is almost assuredly blued titanium or anodized aluminum, just because of the inertial forces at play there rotating that tourbillon carriage.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to want to make that as light as possible, particularly because they've actually been able to achieve a performance of plus or minus 0.5 seconds a day, which is
that's remarkable.
An order of magnitude improvements over the cost rating. So it's really quite impressive. And my hat's always off to any manufacturer who actually pursues making a tourbillon mechanism to do what a tourbillon mechanism was meant to do.
Yes.
Unlike these tourbillons out of China that are plus or minus 60 seconds a day.
They've really taken it to that extreme level. I'll be curious to see how much of this actually ends up in a production watch eventually. And if it, obviously this is partially being done as an experiment and as a sort of trial to see what can work and what doesn't work. And I'll be curious to see how much of this shows up in a watch, 3 or 4 years from now, and see which elements we actually get. I can imagine that producing this must be astronomically expensive. And I guess that's the other question is Grand Seiko interested in getting into that level of the market? Obviously they do produce some expensive pieces, but this I think would go into a whole other level in terms of what they've produced in the past.
Yeah, I would imagine if they were to put a price tag on this piece, they would finally crack that 6-figure mark.
Oh, yeah, easily. I can't imagine this being, this is in that Ferdinand Berthoud sort of price range, right? I can't see it being, less than sort of $250,000 just based on the amount of work that would be involved in actually making this. Forget whatever they do with the case and the dial and everything else. Just the movement alone is ridiculous in terms of the machining that's required for this.
Mm-hmm. And as Jack Forster pointed out when he wrote about this for Hodinkee, nothing makes a collector want to watch more than being told he can't have it.
Yes. That there are so many collectors out there with money who are saying this and this thing. Really? There's no price tag on this?
So you've been getting up to some interesting machining here in your own studio.
Yeah, there's been a few interesting projects and things that are a lot of making tools for tools to make, well, not other tools in every case, but sometimes other tools.
Tools all the way down.
It's tools all the way down. And lately I've been working on some tool posts for my Trypan tool holder, which is it's a very accurate quick change tool post that I use on my lathes, which is a really nice design. So I've been working on some tool holders for that. And that actually led us to talking a little while ago about sign vices, which is something that you hadn't actually seen before.
I still haven't seen. You have not shown me
Have
your
I
sine
not
vise.
shown you the sine
I've
vise?
seen videos now. I've seen pictures on the internet. I've had people
all right.
explain them to me from the other side of the world, but I have not seen your sine vise.
After we're finished recording here, John, I will go and show you my sine vise and show you how it's set up. For the listener who has no idea what the heck we're talking about, this isn't a sine vise as in like SIGN. This isn't something that has a big sign across the front of it saying, don't touch or something like that. This is an SINE vise. And if you remember way back to your high school mathematics class, and you remember your trigonometry, sine is one of the ways that you can calculate the angle of a right angle triangle. And so a sine vise is actually a vise which can be adjusted. The angle on it can be adjusted using a very accurate block that sits between the base of it and a pin. And that allows you to get extremely precise angles out of your vise. And in my case, I needed it because the tool holders that I'm making, these Trypan tool holders, they actually have an odd angle that's on one of the sides. So I wanted to be able to grip it very well and be able to hold the part properly, but B, be able to actually maintain that angle. And the probably the best way of doing it is in a sine vise like this.
And the mechanism for adjusting your sine vise is something we touched on way back in our episode on the book The Perfectionists.
In order to get precision out of your sine vise, you need to have a way of getting that pin raised up an exact amount from the base. And so we use precision gauge blocks for doing that. And gauge blocks are impressive because they have been machined and ground to a very, very accurate level. And in fact, they are not only are they incredibly accurate, but they are extremely flat, and flat enough that if you ring two of them together, so if you actually put two of them together and twist them, they will not come apart easily. You're actually going to wring the air out of the gap between them. And so they will actually stick together, which is sort of a fun little trick.
They can give it to the strongest person you know, and they wouldn't be able to pull them together. But if you shear them apart, slide them across each other, then you can very easily take them apart. Yeah,
they will shear apart, but they won't pull apart easily. You've removed all of that air from there, and you've actually created a vacuum in between them, which is rather impressive.
All the little atoms are making out.
So yeah, it's sort of an interesting way of machining things. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't ever see. Machinists, it's one of those tricks that machinists know about. But if your kid's ever asking you, when am I ever going to need this trigonometry thing? Well, sadly, I need to remember how to do it all the time when I'm in the shop, when I'm using something like this. It's something that I actually need to use.
For anyone who might not understand or quite grok what it is you're making with your sine vise, what are these Trypan posts that you're building with the sine vise?
So these tool holders are designed to hold lathe tools in them, and so they match up with a tool post that is mounted on the lathe, and then the tool holders slide onto that tool post. And they're designed to be able to quickly move the tools on and off of the lathe. And as part of that, we also want to be able to accurately put them back on the lathe, so that when you remove a tool, let's say to be able to measure something, you want to be able to put that tool back on and know that it's exactly where it was when you took it off. And so these tool holders are designed to be able to accurately fit back onto the lathe, so that you don't have to worry about that tool having moved a great deal between them, between times that you've actually put it on and off. And that includes things like the center height, as we've talked about before. Center height of a tool is extremely important. Mm-hmm. You want to make sure that especially when you're dealing with micromechanics like this, the further off you are from the center, the more likely you're going to have problems with cut quality. You're going to have problems with the part catching on the tool and being thrown from the lathe. You can also end up with serious problems with tool wear, because now instead of cutting, you're actually rubbing, and so you're not getting a proper chip formed off of it, and so you're actually having issues because of that. So these tool posts and tool holders are designed to make my life easier as I'm changing tools out, and I'm going back and forth between the different types of tools that I use on a regular basis.
Are there any other tools you've been been putting together to help make your life easier?
Yeah, so I've also been working on a Wobble Stick, which is a fun little tool that's been used by watchmakers for centuries to be able to accurately center features on the lathe, primarily holes that you're working on. And so with a Wobble Stick, you're basically using leverage. One end is on the short part of the lever, and it is the part that you stick in the hole that you're trying to center. And then the other end of the Wobble Stick is very, very far away from the center of rotation. And it's, as you have very, very small movements on the short side of the lever, you get very large movements on the long side of the lever. So it allows you to very precisely see where you're off in terms of centering that hole. And you can then adjust the part in the lathe and be able to replace it on the lathe, or place it the first time on the lathe if you need to center exactly on the hole that you're working on. And it's sort of a fun little use of levers and physics to be able to see exactly where a part is, and with what is really a very primitive tool, be able to center something with an incredible amount of accuracy.
Now, of course, being Chris Manning, you would not be satisfied with just simply using a very primitive tool.
No, of course not. Of course not. Why would I go with a primitive tool when I can create an over-engineered tool that I can use on my machine?
So how have you pimped out your Wobble Stick?
Well, I don't. It's sort of a difficult thing to explain, and over the podcast like this. But there's most Wobble Sticks are really just going to have a fork that is held on that's sort of sitting upright, and the Wobble Stick sits on that fork and is just sort of free floating there. And instead of free floating it, what I've done is I've actually captured the Wobble Stick in a universal joint. And that universal joint can then allow it to rotate left and right as necessary, or up and down as necessary, in order to stay centered in that hole. And the reason that I've done that is because I want to be able to mount this Wobble Stick in one of these tool post holders that I'm making for the Trypan tool post. And that way I know that when that Wobble Stick goes back onto the machine, it's always perfectly at the right center height. One of the problems that I find with, the way that other people have designed their Wobble Sticks is that there can be variance in terms of that fork that's sitting there and the stick as it's sitting in the fork. And so you can, if you've got chips sitting underneath on the bed of the lathe or whatever, then you can run into problems with that. Or, if you've set up the Wobble Stick so that it's designed to run on the actual bed of the lathe, well, if your cross slide is in the way, now you've got to move the cross slide out of the way in order to get the mount for the Wobble Stick in place so that it's at the right height. Like there are a lot of annoyances with the way that they've been made traditionally. So as I said, I'm basically using a universal joint in mine, and it'll allow me to get better repeatability so that when I go and drop my Wobble Stick back on the lathe, then I know that it's going to be, at exactly that center height, and it's sort of easy for me to work with and know that I'm not fighting the part or fighting the tool because it's not where it's supposed to be.
So the extra effort on the front end should save you some effort on
the back end. Yeah, that's the idea. We'll see. These ideas are great until we try them, and so we'll see if it actually works well enough for what I'm trying to do. The idea of the universal joint is certainly not new, and it should work well enough for what I'm trying to do. So we'll see what happens, and I think it'll be fine. The biggest thing is getting it so that it will move freely, and also getting it so that ratio between the short side and the long side is long enough. Like in my case, I'm looking at probably 1 centimeter on one side and probably 100 centimeters on the other side. So there will be a very obvious difference in movement between one and the other. Even if all you're doing is moving 1/100th of a millimeter on one side, you'll be able to see a millimeter of movement on the long side of it. And that's really what you want to do. And visually, the human eye can obviously see quite easily a smaller movement than a millimeter. And in fact, you can also put a little gauge on, gauge chart or whatever beside the long end of it, and you'll be able to see very easily how much it's moving. Now, of course, all of this is not just for the work that I'm doing on my own watches, because frankly, I don't need wobble sticks for my own watch. I'm just dropping a movement in.
You don't need to make sure everything's upright and true and your pizou calibers.
No, that's, presumably they've already done that for me. That's the hope. That's why I'm paying the money, is in fact good money, is that they've already done all that hard work for me. But it is useful for some other things, like, if you're making your own watch movement from scratch.
Oh really?
Yeah.
What is this all about?
Well, I don't know, John. You and I have talked a lot about over the years of different designs, and we've even gone so far as to talk a little bit about watchmaking and starting to read through some of that. But something that's even more interesting than just reading through watchmaking and talking about it is actually trying to make a watch.
Actually, it'd be a lot more fun if we actually cut some metal.
Oh yeah,
yeah, no.
Yeah.
What's taking so long?
So one of the things, and in fact, we've talked a little bit about the Christian Lass's master watchmaking course that he has on how to rebuild the bridges and cocks in a 6497. And so we've decided we're going to try our hand at making one. So we get to make some chips and actually design our own watch movement, or at least parts of the watch movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all we've done up to this point is just do a bit of drawing and throw a couple of ideas out there. We've yet to actually dig into any metal yet. And I was a little reticent about basing it on an ETA 6497, but I've come around to it, primarily because that's just going to be a whole lot easier, and I will in no way be attached to it.
Well, that's the nice thing about it, is that it is an easy movement to work on. It's nice and large. It's simple to use. It's commonly available. And at the end of the day, we're not going to be deeply in love with it. It's not as if it's going to be a completely custom movement. But the nice thing is that it gets us the opportunity to try some of these things that, we've been watching in Christian's videos, and that we've been reading about in watchmaking, and that we've been, talking about when we talk about these watches that other people are making in terms of design. And we can make design choices that we want. And, again, we can try finishing and doing some of these finishing techniques that we see on, watches like the Ferdinand Berthoud and whatnot. So we can actually try our hand at some of that and see, what works well, what doesn't work well. And, it's sort of an interesting opportunity to experiment with some of the things that we've been talking about and try our hand at it ourselves.
Yeah, so for this initial foray, we'll be keeping the main plate as is, which has certainly thrown a number of constraints on the project, but we're going to embrace those constraints and allow us to move a little quicker and experiment faster and just play around with things. Yeah, I think we've made some interesting choices. We've decided to replace all of the bridges and the cock and design our own, and I think we've made some interesting choices with that. We're not quite ready to share some of the visuals of it just yet, but we'll talk a little bit about it as we go. Just because I think it's interesting for you and I to talk about it, and then we can, and some of the challenges that we've had, like, we went off and made some. I had a print made of a 6497 in quite large scale. I think it's like 20:1 scale, and we sort of drew on it one day with some markers and pencil crayons, and to sort of get a sense of where we wanted to look at it. But then as we started modeling it up in Fusion to sort of get a better sense of proportions and whatnot, we actually changed our mind on a couple of design choices and decided to accentuate a few of the shapes and curves that we were working on. And certainly, the average person looking at this, or even the more informed person looking at this, they're not going to know that this is a 6497 by the time we're done with it. I don't know if I'd make that strong a boast yet. I think we've made enough design changes to it, and even going so far as to move some of the things like screws and whatnot. So certainly the average, the person who's familiar with the 6497 is not going to see many of the cues that they would recognize from that movement when they look at this. Mm-hmm. Yes, it should not be immediately obvious. No. But to a more scrutinizing eye, you'll be able to pick on plenty of little cues. Yeah. So this is an interesting way of starting with it. And as you said, this provides us with a lot of design constraints, which I actually find really important, especially when learning something new. It's much easier to work within constraints because it forces you to to sort of figure out problems. If you can change absolutely everything, you
you're not necessarily forced to confront some of the design challenges that you have. So I like that as sort of as a designer, having some of those constraints. And this will eventually lead us down the road of figuring out, okay, we can experiment with this little part of the movement because that's the only thing that we're changing. And eventually we'll have tried enough of these design changes that we'll then be able to go, well, you know what, let's just start from scratch. And we'll have a much better understanding and of what we want to do with a movement, or what I want to do with a movement. I don't know how far you decide to go down this road as well with me, but certainly this will give me a lot of the tools, the design tools that I need to eventually make what I want to make, which is going to be smaller than a 6497 to be sure. That's a limitation that I'm not very happy with. I want to be able to make smaller watches for people who prefer smaller watches, and this movement is not going to let us do that. But the techniques and the designing that we put into this now is going to eventually lead to being able to make a smaller movement that's a little bit more feasible in terms of making a modern wristwatch out of it.
It is a solid, reliable base to be working off of. There's a reason they use this movement in watchmaking schools, and there's a reason that I would say dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of people who've sort of carved out their own first watch have started with this particular movement. Yeah. And again, just because this is where we start with it doesn't mean that that's where, eventually we end with it. It's we've got a couple of ideas for maybe a version 2 and 3 and maybe even a 4 eventually that we can change more and more of it as we go and add sort of our own twist and we can add our own opinions into watches, because we talk a lot about other people's watches and we have opinions about a lot of other people's watches. So we figured, why not? Let's actually put our opinions to the test and see how they work. Well, I have exercised my opinion on free spring balances in just about every watch I own. I know you have, but this is a chance to try that a little bit. So yeah, I guess that's a good question. Like what are some of the choices that we decided to make with this version 1 watch? We've talked about the fact that we're leaving the main plate there and we're replacing a couple of bridges and we're replacing the cock. What are some of the other decisions that we had made in terms of what we wanted to accomplish with this? Not a whole lot else for this particular version 1. We'll be redoing the click for sure. Mm-hmm. And then, we're going to take a shot at making this a free sprung movement as well. Yeah, that I think is one of the important ones as well, being able to remachine machine a new balance and figure out the pesky spring and pinning points and stuff like that on the hairspring. So I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be an interesting challenge. The rest of it, the actual changing of the bridges and the cock, that's an interesting problem, and I'm looking forward to trying it. But it's not particularly revolutionary. It's it's still relatively simple metal work that's involved in that, and most of that metal work is not particularly precision guided. As long as you get the holes in the right spot, the rest of it, the shape of it, isn't particularly challenging. It can be any shape you want to be, really. So that part isn't particularly difficult from a machining point of view, but the free sprung balance is the bit that I'm interested in. That'll be fun. Yeah. I'm looking forward to it. So stay tuned. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it, and we'll eventually be posting some photos and videos of some of the stuff that we're doing.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.